I'm always getting questions about how to EQ your guitar tone, what's the best type of EQ to use, all that stuff. We're going to go through it in today's video. I'm going to show you guys exactly how I EQ my guitar tones. This particular tone that we're using in this video is on my quad cortex, and I made it with a private student of mine. If you guys want to get private lessons where we can go through anything from guitar technique to dialing in tones, reviewing mixes, social media mentorship, all that stuff, feel free to hit me up on Instagram. The link will be somewhere down in the description below. In this particular lesson with Giorgio, we created this tone for him based on some amps and stuff that he wanted to use, and he wanted to use a Victory amp, and I've never actually used that before, so it was actually cool for me to kind of use something that was a little bit different. But by the end of it, we made some changes to his tone that we thought really suited well with his playing style and his mix and his live tone as well. And what I want to do is go through how we can get it from sounding like this, where there's no EQ at all, to this with all the EQ patches turned on. If you guys don't get through to the end of this video, the one thing that I want you to take away from this video, if anything, is the fact that, EQ is very, very independent. The general rule that I like to follow with EQ, whether it's with guitar tones or anything else, is that I want the first starting sound, I want the starting point, the foundation to be the best sound that I can possibly get. Right now, again, this is what it sounds like without the EQ. I think it sounds pretty good, nice and tight, 6-string, high gain, modern metal type of tone. But then once you start putting all the EQ blocks in and shaping the tone slightly, you're not trying to change the tone, you're just trying to accentuate the best parts of it, and it ends up sounding something like this. Slightly tighter, slightly more aggressive, maybe a bit more top-endy, but the overall tonal characteristics of the tone, from the way the amp sounds to the way that cab sounds, it's not changing too much. It's just, again, kind of like lifting a blanket off of the tone. So going through the tone that me and Giorgio built together for him in our private lesson. So we have a noise gate. Obviously, I like my noise gates really tight. We have this kind of like pitch shifter and an additional EQ for any drop tuning, but we won't go through that. Maybe we can go through that in another video. I then decided to use the Fulton Hex Drive pedal. I really like this pedal. And then there's an EQ after that pedal. Now, this EQ is essentially affecting our guitar DI after it's passed into the overdrive before it's hit the front of the amp. I just thought that, for this particular tone for Giorgio, which by the way, if you want to download, it will be available on my Cortex Cloud account. You can download this for free and try it out on your quad Cortex, although you might need to make a couple of adjustments. I thought that for this amp that he wanted to use and the cab and his guitar and everything, I wanted the low end to be a bit more clean going into the front of the amp. This is in drop C. I'm using my Jackson Mishimetsu USA HT6, and it's loaded up with bare knuckle juggernauts. Very kind of, pushy in the low mids and stuff, and maybe that's why I felt the need to do this. But what I want to get out of this particular EQ instance before it hits the front of the amp is to just make the guitar DI a little bit cleaner, maybe make it a little bit more concentrated, a little bit more tighter in the bottom end, so that when it hits that gain at the front of the amp, it saturates in a way that's a bit more even across the, the frequency spectrum, not just grabbing onto the low mids and distorting them and saturating them before anything else, With that EQ on, it sounds like this. And when it's turned off, it sounds like this. So you can probably tell it's just a little less tight and the low end a bit more round, a bit more warm. I like the sound of when the EQ is on. I like a bit more of a sterile sound going into the front of the amp. So if that's something that you're after, you can try use this little EQ trick before it hits the front of the amp to just clean up your DI a little bit. And then we went on to the Victory Kraken on channel 2. This is the amp settings that we're using. Again, it doesn't really matter. It's going to change from every guitar to every guitar player, but you can see that the master is dialed pretty quiet. I just wanted it to be a little bit more sterile and a little less saturated and squishy. This amp actually sounds really, really good. It really surprised me because I would never think to pick this amp, but after dialing in this tone with Giorgio in our lesson, it really did kind of sound good, and I was really surprised with that. Next up, we have a little bit of EQ after the amp. Now, this is something that I like to implement very, very subtly after the amp, between the amp and the cab. This is just kind of like subtly EQing things that I don't feel like I can reach by turning the knobs on the amp, you know? Sometimes I want a very particular frequency to kind of dip before it hits the cab and stuff like that. Or if I'm turning the mid knob and it's just not getting where I want it to get, I'll get an EQ after and do like very, very subtle changes. So as you can see here, the moves are very, very small. We have a 0.3 dB boost at 125 Hertz. That's kind of just to get the palm mutes a bit more thicker. And then kind of counteracting that by, you know, dipping 250 and 500 by half a dB, and even like 1K by 0.3 a dB. Like, again, that kind of mid-range. I do like that mid-range scoop, and I do like that low end, or like low mids rather, to be a little bit scooped as well, so that it just brings a little bit more definition out of the notes, especially with palm mutes and stuff. Like, I like that kind of like squelchy, like a robot sucking up bolts sound, you know what I mean? So that definitely helps with that. And then 4K, dipping that slightly and then giving it some air around 8K. I'm doing a high pass at 50 Hertz, so just getting that really subby low end out before it hits the cab. And then I'm also bringing up a high cut around 15K to just get rid of any like whistly frequencies. I find that using an EQ before the cab block, rather, right after the amp, kind of gets rid of that like digitalness, if that makes sense, you know? Of course, it sounds amazing either way, but I find that high cutting before the cab, I don't know, it just sounds a little bit nicer to the ears. When Giorgio and I were dialing this tone in our lesson, you know, we decided to use two different cabs to kind of make up the cab sound. The first one is a Mesa rectifier, you know, 4x12 with vintage 30s in it, very standard, loaded up with a 57 and a 414 microphone. I really like the sound of this cab. It's just very, you know, it's kind of like a baseline for me across all my tones. If it sounds good with this, it kind of sounds good with anything. But funnily enough, that is not making up the bulk of this tone. I thought that for the Victory amp in particular, one thing that it really would have suited was this Zilla cab. So this is a Zilla custom vintage 34x12 that is within the Quad Cortex. And again, loaded up with a 57, and I chose a Ribbon 160 mic for this one. It's actually 75-25 in way of the Zilla cab. So you can see the balance there. Most of it is going towards that Zilla cab. And I just found that, you know, that cab in particular just brought something really interesting in the mid-range, and then kind of blending in that very typical kind of like 4x12 Mesa rectifier sound, just kind of brought it home. And this is what that sounds like. Sounds great. It does the thing, and I was very happy with it when we stumbled upon that. But the reason why they can sound clean together is because there's an EQ block right after each cab, and it's affecting each cab differently. So what I did when I was dialing it in was I started with the one cab initially, which was the top one here, and I was kind of scraping around for some frequencies that I thought were a little bit whistly within this particular cab, with these sets of microphones in these positions, so on and so forth. And as you can see by the EQ block that I have right after it, we just have a little dip around 4200 and then another dip around 5600, which to me, at that moment in time, those frequencies were really kind of like, you know, those are the ones that were sticking out and kind of were getting in the way of like that really nice, sweet top end sound. If I change the balance of this cab so that we're only hearing the 4x12 recto, and I kind of play around and I turn the EQ off, you'll hear those frequencies come in straight away. Super subtle, I'm not trying to overdo it, but that combined with that exact same process on the Zilla cab with these two. So for this one, it was around 4300 and 3600. Those are the frequencies that I was hearing there. So if we listen to the Zilla cab and do the same thing. So yeah, those two EQ blocks there, once they're kind of like getting rid of those really harsh frequencies for each cab individually, and then they come together, it just softens up the top end a little bit, you know, and makes it really nice on the ears. If I turn both of those off and, you know, play something. you can probably tell that it sounds way cleaner and just way more nice, you know? Usually, you know, if I was working in the box of plugins, I would do that with an EQ after the tone, but given that we're using the quad cortex, or, you know, if you had any other modeler, I'm sure you could kind of model the same thing where you have the split chain with the cabs and, you know, the two EQ blocks. With the quad, it just gives, you know, a lot of flexibility to kind of do stuff like that, which I'm a big fan of, clearly, since there's like eight EQ blocks on this chain. So that kind of makes up the tone as I'd see it, you know, like the tone without kind of any post-processing on it. Obviously there is post-processing, but the tone as it stands, you know, with no low cuts and high cuts at the end, without any EQ shaping, this is what the tone sounds like. And then when I turn on the last three EQ blocks in the chain, this is what that sounds like. So you can probably tell it doesn't sound all that much different, but what it does sound like, at least to me anyway, is that it's just a more refined, cleaner, more polished version of that original, I guess, like raw tone. And again, that's exactly what I try to do with the EQ. I don't try and overdo it. I'm not trying to make a different tone completely. I'm just trying to get the good source tone that we had and then just clean it up a little bit, maybe get rid of some whistly stuff, cut out any unnecessary low end, and just kind of make it feel a little bit more succinct. We'll go through the blocks, you know, back to front, because it makes more sense that way to me anyway. So the last EQ block on the chain over here is just a simple low and high cut. The reason why I like using this dedicated low high cut block within the quad cortex is that you can change the slopes of the low and high cut. And this gives me even more flexibility. So with the low cuts these days, I like a really, really tight, you know, dB per octave cut on my low end. I'm doing a 48 dB per octave cut at 75 Hertz. And then on the high cut, it's a little bit softer. I find that that sounds a bit more natural. Just your typical, you know, 12 dB per octave, around 15.5K. And this block was more so for Giorgio's live tone, so that when he plays live, he's just kind of cleaning up on any unnecessary low end and top end that might get in the way of other instruments and stuff, especially when you're pumping it through a PA at like 100 dB. Those can get really annoying. So just cutting that out there, super subtle, but it does do its job. Behind that, we have the more traditional like post-processing EQ block. Now, as I mentioned in another video just recently on the channel, what I like doing is, you know, recording the tone into my DAW and then opening up an external EQ plugin like FabFilter Pro Q or something like that, EQing the tone in there and then copying those values back into the quad, because I just find the workflow of Pro Q, it's very familiar to me. I've been using it for years and I find that I get better results doing that. So I like doing it there and then copying it over. And then this was the result for this specific tone for Giorgio with this guitar and all that stuff, right? It's the same general kind of practice, but, you know, don't go copying the values because they're going to be very different. So just some low, mid and mid cleanup around like, you know, 250-ish, 400 Hertz, just to clean that up ever so slightly. And then again, just kind of taking out any like annoying, you know, harsh frequencies that I was hearing, typically around that like, you know, 3700, 3800 mark. We have another one around 4900. And then another round around 4,500, but then lifting the top air of the tone to kind of bring back some life after we've just been sucking out all of the top end. I find that this kind of, you know, area top end past 7K, in this instance around 7,300 Hertz, it like lifts the blanket off the tone. It just kind of brightens it up in a very pleasing way, as opposed to kind of doing it around the 5K mark, which can get a little bit harsh sometimes. And then this last EQ block, which is the first EQ block, if that makes sense. This is just to kind of counteract any of the low end and high cut effect that has on your ears. So for example, like if you have a broad tone and then you cut off the, well, I guess on camera, this would be the high end, right? Maybe I'm wrong. And then this would be the low end. You're kind of shifting the listener's focus towards the middle of the frequency spectrum. And I find that sometimes just like a slight dip around like the 600 mark, that kind of like really warm mid-rangey part. Just a slight dip there, very broad dip. In this case, it's like just under a dB. I find that kind of levels out the tone a little bit and doesn't make it seem so nasally, because when you've kind of focused it in on the mid-range, it's hard to kind of get that sound out. But I find that this counteracts it just the way I want it to. So altogether, you know, when you break it down block by block and what each EQ block is doing, it doesn't seem that crazy, but it looks crazy when you have it because there's literally 8 EQ blocks on this chain. And again, it's all relative. Having this many EQ blocks on a chain doesn't mean that the tone is bad. You know, it doesn't mean that the tones on the quad aren't good. You know, it's actually quite the opposite. The tones in the quad are so accurate that, you know, they're not trying to hide any like weird frequencies. They don't have any processing on them. Well, I'm sure some of them do, but not to the extent that you would do in a case like this, right? Not every IR is made equal. Not every cab block is made equal. So I like going through and just dipping those very select frequencies for those very specific cab and microphone combinations that I'm hearing, so that I can get a cleaner version of the tone. I'm very used to this kind of like very post-process tone, you know? To me, that sounds great, and I would happily jam on that. But, you know, to some people, it might be a little bit too much. I have the scene B here where all of the EQ is turned off and it sounds like this. And, you know, that obviously sounds a little bit more raw, a little bit more natural. And to some people, it feels better to play through something like that. For me, personally, I like the sound of the very tight post-process kind of. That to me is exactly where I want my tone to be. I think the block that has the biggest change on the tone overall is this block right here after the overdrive. I'm such a big believer in, like, you know, dialing in the feel of the guitar going into the front of the amp before anything else. That to me kind of gives me the satisfaction that I need as a player. You know, if palm mutes sound like this and not like this, like when the EQ's off, it's just too much low end going into the front of the amp, you know? Or a better way to think of it is like this particular amp block, this Victory Kraken, is not saturating the low mids the way that I want to. It's grabbing onto them too much. Different amps will react differently. So for this purpose, for this tone for Giorgio, we kind of decided to dial that back before it hits the front of the amp, because it didn't sound good when I was dialing bass less. It didn't sound good when I was dialing mids any less, because it was starting to affect other frequencies, and I didn't want it to do that. I just wanted it to sound tighter from the get-go. So this EQ block will probably change depending on what guitar you're using, and how you physically play as a player. Like if you pick a little bit softer, you might have a little bit more low-end bloom, like, and you know, especially with that EQ off, like it can just get really, really round. But if you pick hard, like me, it gets you that, you know, that very tight, articulate, machine-like sound, which I'm a big fan of. But yeah, hopefully this helped you guys in what to do when you're EQing your tones, or if you have a quad and you want to get the best out of it and you want to get the best tones that you can with your amps, with the pedals that you like and all that stuff, kind of following this step-by-step method on, you know, where to set the EQ blocks and what they're trying to do and what you're trying to achieve. I hope that this sheds some light on that and you can now go and try it out for yourself. If you want to book in a lesson with me like Giorgio did, where we can kind of go through your tones one by one with your guitar and I can basically dial it for you over a Zoom call, hit me up on Instagram. And if you want to do anything guitar related, mixing related, we can do that stuff as well. This tone will be out on Cortex Cloud if you want to try it for yourself. And until next time, I'll catch you guys later. Thank you so much for watching. Peace.